We started Culturally Speaking to indulge our curiosity about the way others live and a desire to inspire conversations about how we have far more in common than we realise.
Okay, so today we have a very interesting interview, I would say. You know, when we first came across Christopher, I think we thought we were going to talk to the people who were in the story. Well, at least I thought so. And then we ended up talking to Christopher, who directed the documentary. And I thought it was a really interesting perspective.
Yeah, no, I remember that. I think I initially engaged with starting to put this episode together. And then you asked, so are we going to speak to the women? And I was like, well, no, we're going to speak to Christopher, who directed this documentary about the women and their story. And we also watched it. He very kindly let us have a preview of this documentary before it premiered. And I wasn't quite sure what it was going to be when it started, if I'm being honest. I wasn't sure how the story was going to be told, but I really, really respected the way that he let their story be told by them. And he took real care, I felt, to make sure that, and he said it right in the way that the editing process, he didn't get it approved unless they were happy with it, which is quite unusual.
You know, when, because obviously you did the initial engagement with Christopher, and when you told me the topic of his documentary, what it made me think of is all the recent and historic Me Too movement things, right? Of essentially women who are being abused, right, for the lack of a better word. And I am glad that a lot of that is coming to light. We've had famous cases like, Ghislaine Maxwell in prison and Epstein and all of those things, and Harvey, what's his name? Weinstein. But as you know, and people who know me well know that I'm really into true crime. One pattern, though, is that, and, this is what makes Christopher's documentary even more valuable, in my opinion, is this thing called the missing white woman syndrome. Now, I'm not kind of, undermining any missing women at all of any race, but I think because of how society works, you do see a lot of high-profile cases, but that is not very representative of all the cases, in my opinion, right? You have, we talked about this, Emily Ratajkowski's new book about what happened when she made the music video. I don't even remember the name now of the song, but
Blurred Lines.
Yeah, that. And it's great. People should come out and speak their truths, and if there were wrongdoings, people should be prosecuted, etc., etc. It's all great. But before talking to Christopher about, the plight of these Ethiopian women, I would say that I would admit that I didn't really give it a thought because it wasn't in my reality. Yeah. And all I knew about Ethiopia was probably the food I can get at the market.
And Haile Selassie, right? As he's for me as a historian, yes.
Yeah.
Going back to your white missing woman syndrome, I think we've seen the rise of people questioning that here. I think particularly in the UK, we've had some high-profile cases this year. Sarah Everard, the huge numbers of women that came out to protest that. But, months later, we had a woman of colour that went missing. And the news cycle on that felt very, very short in comparison. And it's not a comparison because, there are different people, different cases, but women of every color, nationality, race, ethnicity go missing every single day, right? That is a fact. But only certain stories really become part of our consciousness in the media. And I think the other example of that is Nigeria, right? Boko Haram, bring back our girls. I mean, that became very, very prevalent because it took the likes of someone like Michelle Obama to bring it to our consciousness. But there are girls like that across that continent and across others, ultimately. I mean, Afghanistan's a great example. Would we have been talking about that without Malala? But we need more than just these small pockets.
That's a good point, though, right? Because there is so much about the world that we don't know, and it's impossible to know everything. So I'll be curious to know, like, what is the solution, in quotes of, do you know what I mean? Because however naturally curious we are, like you and I are, we would go seek out information like this. And if we weren't doing this podcast, we wouldn't have come across Christopher and found out about this story. But then we are limited essentially by, this is a bigger conversation around what's being funded. And Christopher mentions in his story the challenges in that when you cover something which might not be, the hot potato of the moment.
Completely. And I think that's one of the reasons why I personally like to have a really diverse curation of friends, contacts, and sources that I get my information from to try and readdress and rebalance some of the things I know I can very easily access in mainstream media.
I mean, that's another topic, right? Mainstream media, because I'll admit, I've completely lost faith in mainstream media. I think, for one, fact doesn't seem to be the currency anymore, right? A lot of things, it doesn't matter which side of whatever camp you're on, actually. It's got to the point where nothing seems to be based on facts anymore. It's a lot of politicized and almost personal agenda on each and every single article. And I would challenge that, because in the old days, without the internet, without anything, back to what are those people called? Like people who shout out the news, like in the town. Do you know what I mean?
The people who
there's a term for them. Like there's someone who will basically shout out the latest things, like in the town square. That's before we had print and newspaper and things like that. So what I'm trying to... Is it a town crier?
Yes, that's it. Like, so when there's new bills and laws, they will...
Yeah, so we progressed, obviously, to more accessible information. And we used to hold things like newspapers as the source of information, source of facts, source of stories of what happened, because we couldn't be there, right, all the time to see it. And now it's exploded into this whole industry where headlines are clickbaits. And I kind of feel like, but our willingness and ability to distinguish fact from fiction hasn't developed along with it. It hasn't developed at the same pace.
Our critical thinking, and there's a big thing around, we used to put trust in newspapers in the broadsheets, right? In this country in particular, the British print media in particular. And that has been eroded over time. So, back to my point of, there are people that are telling stories, right, every day of unsung, untold heroes. As Christopher puts it, right, he thinks these women are the true American heroes. And it's really, I guess, our own responsibility to look and to find, because I don't think there is like you say, there is not one overarching solution that will bring these stories to light.
I mean, without further ado then, shall we listen to Christopher tell a story?
My name is Christopher Chambers. I'm an independent filmmaker based in Los Angeles, California. And I recently completed my second feature film, which is a human rights documentary called A Fire Within. I think this story begins with that article. We all have had that article. It's that article we've clipped from a magazine or newspaper and set aside, or we put the link on our desktop or the PDF somewhere in a folder, thinking, oh, I'm definitely going to read that when I have more time. We all have that article. For me, that article changed my life. I was touring with my previous film, Aram, and I was on a flight back from Sydney, Australia in 2016. I had plenty of free time, and I began to look through those articles, and I landed on that article, which I had clipped and saved and put on my desktop. I opened it up, and it was a story about a human rights violator discovered living in America, and this unbelievable coincidence of these three women who were survivors of torture under this man, who are originally from Ethiopia, who had fled their home country and taken a long journey. And one of the women landed in Atlanta, Georgia, started a waitressing job. And when she started that job, she met one of her coworkers, and when he said hello, she recognized his voice, and it was the voice of the man who was her interrogator and torturer a dozen years earlier back in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. So my jaw dropped, and I started reading more and more, and then when I landed for my layover, I started reading more and more, and the story became more and more incredible, and I became more and more incredulous about wondering why had I never heard of this story. This is an incredible, thrilling, historic, as it turns out, and inspiring story. And that article ended up changing the course of my life for the next 4 years, eventually becoming the film I recently completed, A Fire Within. Well, initially when I read this article, I didn't jump up and say, aha, I shall make a film about this. I thought, oh, this has nothing to do with my culture, my background, I'm neither of the culture nor the generation of the subjects of this film. And I thought, well, this is probably not a story for me to tell. This is a story for someone else to tell. That was 2016. And yet I couldn't shake the story, or it wouldn't shake me. I don't know. Depends how you view your passage in life. And before that, I really didn't know much about Ethiopia at all. I had heard Ethiopic music, which is the oldies, 60s and 70s music. I had heard that probably on the radio here on our world music radio stations, radio shows. So before that, I had only heard Ethiopic music, like the classics on the radio. I thought it was really cool. I had Dorowat. I had Ethiopian food here in Little Ethiopia. But honestly, I'd never met an Ethiopian person in terms of having a personal interaction. I knew nothing about the history. I had heard of Haile Selassie, mostly in the context of Rastafarianism. Which really doesn't tell you anything about the history of Ethiopia. So not only did I know almost nothing about East Africa, I knew nothing about Ethiopia, and I really had no personal connection to Ethiopian culture. And so when I first read this article, I thought it was incredible and there should be a film made about it. But I honestly thought it wasn't going to be me who could do that. But time went by and I just couldn't stop thinking about it. And then one day I thought, well, what if I try? And that began a very long process of trying to reach the women, who are the three women who are the subjects of this documentary. And initially I reached out to them, or attempted to, and none of them would return my emails or my calls. And when you think about it, or when I thought about it, it makes sense, right? You're calling somebody in the middle of their workday and you're saying, hi, I'm a complete stranger with a last name that 100% is not from your culture. And I'd love to bring up the worst thing, the most traumatic thing that ever happened to you in your life. Give me a call, thanks. And so, it made sense. So that was its complete dead end. And then I thought, well, what if I try to reach one of the lawyers involved? And it turns out there's some rather well-established lawyers that were involved in the case, or now are rather well-established. And so that they were easy to track down. And that led me to Miles Alexander, who's a very esteemed lawyer in Atlanta who had a huge career in trademark law and also did human rights cases pro bono on the side. Sort of a legendary character. And he said, yeah, I'm not going to talk to you on the phone, but if you fly out to Atlanta, meet me face to face, I'll be happy to speak with you and then see if I think I should recommend that the women speak with you. And that began the journey of making A Fire Within. I went to Atlanta, we had lunch, and he's sort of this very charming guy. So at the end of it, I had no idea if he liked me or trusted me or not, because he's just sort of had this Southern charm that I coming from Los Angeles, I couldn't tell if he thought I was a dirtbag or if he thought I was earnest in my intentions. And then I got my answer when one evening I got a call from the first of the three women, from Hirut. And that was a 3-hour conversation where we didn't even talk about the film. We didn't talk about my ideas for the film. We talked about everything but the film. We talked about current events, films, books. And that was it. And then a little while later, I received a call from Elizabeth, second woman. Same thing, 3.5-hour, very long conversation covering every sort of topic, but not really talking about the film. And then much later, Edge, who was the woman the woman who moved to Atlanta and who first discovered that her torturer was living in America. Same thing. She then spoke with me, long conversation, and I realized very intelligently they weren't asking me who I was and what I was about and what my intentions were. They were asking me questions about everything else so they could decide who they thought I was. And that began a very emotionally intense relationship, with them eventually agreeing to meet with me in person and discussing the pros and cons of making this film for them, for their lives, putting their story in someone else's hands. And it began a very long and very emotionally intense journey toward making this film. Well, there were a lot of potential trapdoors and pitfalls in making this film. I thought it would take 2 years, but financing it was so difficult that we repeatedly ran out of money and had to stop until I could raise a little bit more money to then shoot the next sequence or go to the next city or country to film. We filmed in 10 cities across America, including Los Angeles, Atlanta, Washington, D.C. We filmed in Canada, and I spent a month in Addis Ababa. And all those challenges are familiar to probably any independent filmmaker, where you'll have meetings with people and institutions, grant-making organizations that you'd think they should be interested in supporting this film, and yet they decline to invest in the film or to issue a grant to your project. And that's just the way it is for an independent filmmaker. There's no shortage of people with great ideas. So that's what you sign up for when you try to make an independent film. And in my case, the bigger challenge, the more daunting challenge, was the responsibility of portraying the true life experience of 3 women, again, not from my culture, not from my generation, who also experienced true, profound trauma, the trauma that I myself have never experienced. And so I made a very unusual decision at the very inception of this project, which is that I made a promise to the 3 women. And I said that I cannot tell the story without you. I can't just show up and interview you and then go away, find archival material, shoot recreations, cut it together, and then there's no way I'm not going to miss the mark, no matter how much research I try to do. And I'm asking for the most supreme amount of vulnerability from them. They have to do this project, they have to tell me about the very, very most horrific moments of their lives, the most heartbreaking moments of their lives. So I made a promise. I said, if you put your trust in me and you share your story with me and you move forward with me to allow me to make this documentary about your life, then I promise that the film will not be finished without you seeing it first. When I'm toward the end of editing, I'll bring you the edit before it's locked, not when it's too late. And I will listen to your feedback. I will take your notes. And if you feel that I have not done justice to your story or that I've screwed up your story in any way, I will listen and I will go back to work and I will fix my mistakes. And this is something that's sort of lunacy. Like, no filmmaker could do this, should do this really normally, because if your subject then decides that they're never happy with your representation of their story, which could be just as likely as unlikely, then you'll never finish the film. But I felt like this was the right way to make this story. And the women also felt that this felt right to them. And that was the basis upon which we moved forward. And it was absolutely critical because even though it added, honestly, probably 8 weeks more to editing, and it was extremely emotionally difficult to go to their homes and show them the film sitting side by side. In the case of two of the women, sitting next to them on a couch and watching this film with them, watching the cut with them, watching their story be told, watching the worst moments of their life be presented, and also distilled, right? This has to be in a documentary. It's an hour and a half long. We have to cut out so much. And then when I did that the first time around, hearing from each of them, well, here's what you got wrong. So Christopher, you connected this and this, subtextually, and she's like, that's not the way it really was. That's not what it was like for us. We can see why you thought that, but that's not what it was like for us. So I would then sort of have the wind knocked out of me, and I went back to my editor, Jim McGilbane, and I said, okay, good news and bad news. Good news is this, and this they thought was great, and this problem has to be fixed, and I don't know how yet. And then, like with everything with making a film, you just say, well, let's try. Let's get back to work. Let's try this. Let's try that. And the real challenge, I think, always with any filmmaking, the real challenge, I think, with any filmmaking is when you have a setback or a challenge to try to say, how can I make this into an advantage? How can I use this as an opportunity to make the film better in a way I had never anticipated? And that was my challenge, was to make sure I served the women's story, because we're really telling their story. And at the same time, try to make it the best film I can with each pass, with each revision. So that's just really the biggest challenge for me, was about how do I tell the story with integrity and make sure I don't miss the mark. And without the women's participation in a very deep and profound way, it would not have been possible. There's so much I learned on this film. I mean, the one thing I love above all else, above filmmaking, is travel, is that experience of sort of losing yourself into a new culture, learning and testing yourself in a new place and learning about a new culture, and the little details that you'll see when you go simply walk down the street and sit down in a cafe, or sit down on to eat in a roadside stand, or stand up at a roadside stand in a different culture, and you start to see these different ways of doing things, these different nuances and these different flavors, and I mean that in every way. So this was truly like an odyssey for me, because I had never been invited to an Ethiopian person's home. I'd never shared a meal with another person who's Ethiopian, which is very different from a Western meal. You eat with injera, you share a communal meal, you eat with your hands. It's very different and a much more intimate way of sharing a meal together. And it's wonderful. For me, probably this is a very heavy subject matter, but I also think it's a very uplifting, empowering, and inspiring story. And that's the real reason behind making this film. But one of the lighter moments was I went to Ethiopia to film. And it was very complicated because we're shooting a human rights documentary. And at the time, I couldn't get a visa. It's a journalism visa you have to get. And I couldn't get a visa to get entry into the country to film. So I was planning on going with my cinematographer, Dominique Martinez, amazing cinematographer. And it took so long that she eventually got booked on to another job. And considering I was constantly running out of money, I couldn't really ask her to wait on this low budget documentary. So eventually I had to go alone. And thank God this Ethiopian producer named Ermias Wolde-Amlak joined the project. And he guided me through everything, the bureaucracy, but also he himself was a survivor of the Red Terror of this era in the 1970s when the women were arrested, interrogated, and tortured. He himself had also been arrested, interrogated, and tortured, and his family had been torn apart by the political dynamic of that era, meaning he had part of his family was on one side, part of his family was on the other. So he had true intimate knowledge of every part of what we were going to cover in the documentary. And he was there watching and advising me and correcting me along the way. But one of the funny things that happened was toward the end of filming, I was returning the equipment to our rental house. So we hired 100% Ethiopian crew, and we did casting there, and all of our actors were hired from Addis Ababa University because we needed young actors, so these were all drama students, which was an extraordinary and very joyful experience, to be honest, because their joy of just making the film kind of rekindled my joy, because I was so stressed out because it was such a challenge to film in this country without any team that I'm familiar with a bureaucracy that is sort of world class. I mean, Ethiopian bureaucracy, there's no way a Western mentality can crack that nut. No way. It's really impressive. So all these challenges plus a finite amount of time. It's a visa. You have to leave after 30 days. If I don't get the footage I need, I don't have it. And maybe we don't have the film. So I'm returning the equipment, and this guy who owns the rental house is having breakfast. And he's drinking his chai, that's the tea that they drink there, and he invites me to sit down. And he doesn't speak much English. I speak hardly any Amharic. I can say hello, how are you? And then it just ends. I just nod after that. And it turns out it's dulet that he's eating. And dulet is raw minced lamb meat. And I said, wow, I've never had this at 10 o'clock in the morning before. In fact, I've never even had raw lamb meat. And I said, I love this. This is what travel's about. So I sit down with this guy who's sort of the kingpin of like camera equipment in Addis Ababa, have this meal with him. And then I meet up with my crew that night in the cast to film the last pieces it's a low budget film. So once we're done with certain pieces of equipment, I return it and then continue filming with only what we need, because it saves, maybe it saves $100, and that matters. So I tell my actors, I said, I had something delicious this morning. I had dulet. And they're like, oh my God. The Ferengi is like foreigner, like American, like eating dulet. That's amazing. I can't believe it. They go, what do you think? I said, it was delicious. It was great. And then that night when we have dinner, everyone's very excited. Like, we found dulet for you because you loved it so much. And I was like, oh, no. There's no way I can survive eating raw lamb meat. I mean, dulet can be other meats too, but raw meat, there's no way I can survive that twice in one day. I mean, I've got a pretty sturdy constitution, but there's no way. So I ate it, finished the shoot, and literally an hour after we finished filming, I was like, oh, I'm sick. I'm going to get sick. And that was one of those experiences where I didn't know what to do, and I just ate dulet. I had a double dulet day, and it got me. One of the things that's fascinating about making a film is that it can take a couple of years. In this case, it took 4 years. And so the meaning of the film changes as your culture changes or as the world changes. And I've never seen that so markedly on any project I've worked on before as I did with this. So I began this in 2017, Trump's America. And at the time, in the back of my head or deep inside, my sort of, the meaning behind the story was a reminder that refugees and immigrants are exactly what makes America great. And sort of in the back of my head was I was hoping there'd be that could serve as a subtle reminder, or perhaps a powerful reminder, that this is what America is all about. It's not about vilifying and degrading immigrants and refugees. It's about remembering and acknowledging and appreciating that, barring the very first Native Americans, of course, without refugees, without immigrants fleeing to America to try to make a better world for themselves, for their families, there would be no America. This is the essence of this nation. So that was in my mind in 2017. Again, this film ended up taking 4 years, and America and the world has gone through so much in those 4 years. Black Lives Matter, Me Too movement. And all of a sudden, as we were making this film and finishing this film, I saw that as we started presenting it in small groups to see how people reacted to it, see if they understood it, the meaning of the story changed because the context in which it was being released had completely changed. Trump was no longer Trump was no longer the president. He was no longer even on Twitter. And now this story about a government official empowered to abuse, to torture, to use force in a way that violated the rights and sometimes even took the lives of individuals resonated in a different way. And then the fact that this story began, at least the American portion of the story began in Atlanta with a woman who was a survivor of abuse, for the first time ever coming to these strangers and saying, this is what happened to me. She'd never even told her own family what happened to her. So she told these lawyers for the first time, and it's covered in the film. And the fact that she told them her truth, came forward and said, this is the abuse that I survived. This is the man who did that to me. And she was believed. That seemed like a very important point in 2017, but now it's sort of this incredible gut punch. It's like a shockwave goes through the room now. That's something that Elizabeth says in the documentary. She knew then, she knew in 2017, and she knows now how important that fact is. But it resonates in such a more powerful way because of the rise of the Me Too movement. So for this film, it's fascinating that it's the same story, but yet its meaning has definitely evolved and changed as it reflects back on the changes in our culture. I mean, every film, I think, is a million heartbreaks and a handful of miracles. And you need to understand when you're trying to make a film, especially an independent film, that you're going to have a lot of setbacks. And things are going to go wrong in ways you could never imagine. And you just have to keep soldiering on. And that takes a toll. It's psychologically, emotionally exhausting, physically exhausting. It can be financially destructive to your well-being as well if you have a project run out of money and there's no way to keep it afloat. But at the same time, you have to have and work toward these little miracles that happen, these wonderful things that arise that sometimes you had nothing to do with, or sometimes it's just your hard work and tenacity. And for me, one of the most extraordinary things that happened on this project, aside from the beautiful connections that were developed and fostered with our cast and crew in Addis Ababa, with the Little Ethiopia Cultural Center and the Habesha Film Association. These are the Ethiopian diaspora community organizations in Los Angeles coming together and bringing together an Ethiopian cast for filming recreations in the States. All of that was very beautiful, very meaningful, and very rich. And they're relationships that I've now have in my life that I'm very grateful for. But I'd say the biggest thing is that to me, these three women are true heroes. And I mean that with no reservation. They're true American heroes. And something that happened on this project that I really didn't anticipate, but I'm very grateful for, is that my heroes became my friends. Just yesterday, I was on the phone with Elizabeth. it's not transactional. It wasn't specifically like, oh, we need to film this, we need to talk about this. It was just to check in on how are you doing? How's this going? Like two friends do. So for me, that's really amazing, and I'm very grateful for that. I used to think I was a cynic, and that the cynic is the greatest romantic, meaning that you're comparing how things can be with how things really are. But I guess I'm an optimist because I see the world, and specifically my country, which is all I really know, I think firsthand, as being on an unstoppable arc toward a better world. And that there's so many setbacks right now, but these to me are these sort of pathetic last gasps of people that have already lost power and already lost relevance. They're trying to claw back land and power that they've already lost. They may have more power now than they did 2 years ago, but I think it's just a done deal that if we zoom out over the next 20 years, the next 50 years, that we're moving toward a fairer, more equitable, more just country and more transparent world, which inevitably will result in a more just world. And I take inspiration from this story, from the fact that this is a story about three women coming to a country where they have no power. They're immigrants and refugees from Ethiopia, a country that most people don't even know where it is on a map in America. They have no connections, no power. But they had an incredible determination to fight for justice. And the fact that three women with no power, no resources, no connections can be successful in that fight, to me is a great sign of hope, beacon of hope. And my secret hope for this film, my secret wish for this film, is that a college student or a law student or a grad student will see this story and reflect on the potential of their life and realize, because this is a true life experience, this is a concrete example of very few people with no power changing the world for the better, that one student, one future leader, one individual who may become a leader in tomorrow's world will become inspired by these three women. And if that happens, that's more than I've ever done with anything else I've done. If that happens, that will achieve more than any project I've ever been involved with. And that gives me hope. I would give, if I have to rate my life from 0 to 10, which on principle I reject the question, but it'd be a 4.65. So I would say that on a personal level, I have wonderful friends. I have a wonderful fiance. I have wonderful parents that are getting older, but they're still very healthy. So I have wonderful nephews who are my other heroes. So I have, on a personal level, I maybe it's an 11 in terms of the meaningful relationships in my life that matter. But if I look at what I'm trying to achieve creatively, I mean, I wish I had been able to make 2 films in the span of 4 years, not just one. So that dwindles down to like a 1.5 to a 2. I hope audiences will respond to this film, and I hope that we can reach an audience around the world, because I think this story is that important and deserves that audience. But really, I'm a storyteller. I want to, if I had the resources, I would be starting another film tomorrow or yesterday. But but the reality is it's more Sisyphusian, and the boulder has to be pushed from the bottom again, and that takes time. So for me, I that number skews much lower because there's so many more stories I want to tell, and there's so much more creative output that I would like to be able to achieve.
So I have to say, right, we watched the documentary before talking to Christopher, and the documentary was difficult to watch in some places. Like, I almost feel like I'm so grateful that I haven't gone through something like that. Like, and so many of us, we have our own challenges and difficulties in life, but it was, the stories were hard, I think, and especially since, we watched it and then talked to Christopher, and then he explained the challenges he went through to produce this, made me appreciate it even more, I think.
I agree. It was a difficult watch, even though I did know about the political situation, but I didn't really have any knowledge of the torture, and certainly not firsthand the way that these women were sharing it, right? But I felt glad by the time I'd finished watching it. I felt really, really glad that these women are here, right, just to tell the story from that point of view, and that they are here, they have survived. What happened to them was absolutely horrific. But also that, as we talked about right at the start of this episode, about magnifying that story, right? I've gone on and had conversations with other people about this, and they weren't aware of it either. And so I take from that, right? It's the power of magnification of these stories, of passing them forward, and shining a light on them. So yeah, that was kind of something that I took from it.
And I think, before listening to Christopher's story, we were talking about this missing white woman syndrome, and in just within this year there were 2 cases of missing women in the UK, and even that, you can see the big difference in media coverage, right? And how people, and I mean, to be fair, right, it could also be that the first one, which is the Sarah Everard case, that came into light and the perpetrator was a police officer. Like, there are factors, I think, which incensed people more than the second case. And I don't know if it's because one happened first, right, that it got more media attention. But yeah, I don't know. To me, I didn't even find out about the second case until I saw it on Twitter, I think. And that was before it was on headlines.
And I think there was, I believe, on Twitter or on social media, it was trending because of the hashtag, people using her name.
Yeah.
Yes. But I think you see that with children that go missing. I mean, one of the most famous cases here in the UK, and even
the McCann case.
Yes. And there's a whole raft of things in that, right? It's class, it's race.
God,
things
that was a whole mess. The whole Madeleine McCann situation.
Yes, but again, there's a very famous case in the UK from the early 2000s about 2 schoolgirls that were, murdered by a man that worked at their school, by him and his partner. I think there's a very iconic image that they're 2 girls in Man United t-shirts. But I guess what I'm trying to say is, where children of other races, colours, nationalities go missing, and they do, with alarming frequency, not just I don't particularly think say the UK, but the world over, it just doesn't feel like these things capture our attention in quite the same way.
I agree. I think, again, right, back to my earlier point about mainstream media being very obviously funded by different parties. And I mean, I'll say it here, I'm not happy about it because, it's impossible for all of us to be sleuths, to go and investigate everything. It's just not possible. You can, like, some people choose to pour their whole lives into, injustices and trying to help. But for the day-to-day person who just wants to stay abreast of what's happening, I think this is setting up to fail. Because, if you just remember back to before Brexit happened, during the campaign running up to the referendum and all of those things, you can see how divided. And the thing is, I'm okay for people to have different opinions, of course. But when you are supposed to be a source of fact, that shouldn't be subjective. Now, of course, there's a whole other conversation around, is anything not subjective?
Oh, you know what my favourite saying is, right? That there are 3 versions of the truth.
Yeah.
Yours, mine, and the reality. Yeah. And that elusive third one, no one ever has their complete truth. There is always perspective, even within a story.
But I think...
there can be neutrality.
Yeah.
There can be neutrality.
And I think that's what I'm after, because obviously nothing is subjective. History books are not objective, right? They are told by the winners, right?
Well, yes, because they get to write
and they
story.
Are not dead, essentially. Yes. but I think the neutrality is a rare currency now, which is why sometimes, I would look at things like Twitter, because you do see both sides of the argument. And I mean, I don't only base my world on Twitter, but I think sometimes it's almost like hearing from the people might give you more truth than relying on mainstream media, is my opinion, right? Because unless you are actually there to witness it, you don't know what happened.
Well, even in being there to witness an event,
your perception is still...
Exactly.
Yeah. On a lighter note, though, I think we were both, kind of giggling when Christopher talked about his food experiences in Ethiopia.
Yes. Oh, the raw lamb mince dish. Dullet, I believe it was called.
I mean, you know me, right? Because I'm a meat eater, and I eat pretty much everything. So I think I would have been okay. With the exception of insects.
I don't mind insects.
Hard no.
Do you not? Like when you go to Thailand or anything, you don't eat any of the like the ants or the crickets?
Anything deep fried is tasty, right?
Yeah.
But I'm talking about cooking it in other ways.
Okay, are you talking like bush tucker trial, like I'm a celebrity, get me out of here?
Okay, that's a hard no.
Because it's raw. Right.
Yeah, that's a definite hard no. But let's say instead of like a spag bol, instead of meat, they use mealworm. I'd be like, no, can't. If it looks like it, I'm not going to eat it.
That's interesting, right? So, for everyone who doesn't know, I'm a pescatarian. And I always find it somewhat amusing where meat eaters won't eat meat that looks like
fish with the eyes on.
Or something that you can quite obviously tell what it originated as. So when it was still moving.
I'm not like that with meat, but I think it's because I generally don't like insects. That I just find them horrible anyway. Growing up as a Chinese person, seeing the food in its whole form is a sign of freshness. Because you can't fake
it. Exactly.
Yeah.
Which is why that's why I find it quite amusing that, if the chicken breast has been packaged up and is sitting on the shelf at Waitrose, it's fine. But if you have to go see the whole thing and get it feathered and deboned and all that.
See, I think that comes down to, what you're used to, right? Because I'm sure if I grew up somewhere where insects were a normal thing to eat, I wouldn't be like this around them. But because I grew up, where we go to markets and chickens are alive before you buy them, and fish are alive before you buy them. So I'm quite okay with that.
Oh my gosh! So your crabs, we have to tell this story.
Oh my god!
So for anyone who doesn't know us, we love to cook, but Janice was going to cook. I think it was a crab dish for Chinese for a festival, right?
It's not really a festival. So for Chinese people, October-ish is kind of, once you've had Mid-Autumn Festival, then you come into crab season. So it's just a thing. Like, we eat crabs in October.
I love it. Everyone else is having pumpkin spice lattes and you're having crabs. That's my kind of...
both orange.
Okay.
So,
exactly.
Yeah. So I never actually had them here, right? Usually I would time it so that I'm in Hong Kong for the crab season, because then, I can eat it there. And then I was in this chat group of my local Chinese supermarket, and they were like, hey guys, we're sourcing some crabs. Do you want some? And then I'm like, hell yeah, I'll have some. Thinking that it would be exactly the same experience, right? To my surprise, they were not tied up. So they were a lot smaller than what I'm used to. And for people who want to look it up, we call them hairy crabs, or you can search for the term mitten crabs, because they're like claws. They've got like fur on them, so they look like they're wearing mittens. Yeah, like cuffs, essentially. So I went and picked up the crabs. They came in a little plastic carrier bag, 2 bags, and they were literally just like alive and happy. Like, they were walking around.
Is this like when you buy a goldfish and it's still, they give it you in a bag?
Yeah, it's like alive. It's,
Okay.
And I kept them in my fridge in the vegetable drawer, because the shop assistant was like, they are going to try to escape, so you need to find somewhere secure to put them. So I put them in the vegetable drawer. And what's supposed to happen is that, so again, I don't want any like hate coming from this, because I would like to think I was very humane. I gave them a nice damp towel to lay on, and I sprayed them with water. So they were all breathing, like they were blinking and everything. But they were in their plastic carrier bag, right, originally, when I put them in the fridge. And the reason we do that is that the low temperature of the fridge is supposed to kind of knock them out. Imagine
relax
you being
them
in a meat freezer, like
Let's not, please.
You'd be asleep, right? Because it's cold.
Yeah.
Like, that's what happens. But I was thinking that perhaps because these are European crabs, they are used to colder temperatures. So guess what? They were not asleep, and they all escaped from their bag.
Which was very stressful, because you were messaging me saying the crabs have got out the bag, and I had this image that the crabs were then scuttling around your kitchen.
No, so they were safely in their little, clear drawer in my fridge. But they were just like, chatting. I don't know if they're chatting, but they were making sounds. And they were like walking around, exploring their new home for a bit. And so eventually what I had to do was I went on YouTube and I found some videos and learned how to tie them up, like how you would buy them actually in other parts of Asia. And then I had them. And then I steamed them and had them. That was good. And
amazing. This
is the thing, right? So I went to the new seafood bar restaurant in Soho. And they had crabs too, but they had, I think, Dungeness crabs, because we only got the legs, right? And they're huge. And it's all cooked for you. And I would actually want to know, of the people eating there, how many of them would be able to deal with a live crab and know what to do with it. Because I really like cooking, as you know. I learned how to like descale a fish, gut a fish. I know how to deal with a, lobster, crab. I can deal with these things when they're alive. But I can't imagine many people sitting there at the restaurant would want to do it. They might find it cruel.
But this comes back to my point of our detachment from the food chain.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's an interesting one. So a few weeks ago, we talked about culture shock. That is a culture shock. Like, okay, that's a misnomer for this because I wasn't shocked. But that's a big cultural difference that I observed living in the UK, which is the detachment from your food source. Like, granted, now, I think a lot of people are more in touch with the, nose to tail eating. People are trying to eat more like organ meat and everything, right, for the nutritional benefits. And also, I guess, to be kinder to the environment. so no wastage and all of that. But Borough Market, which is one of my favorite places in London, it's a novelty. It's like a tourist location for people. And I'm like, but why? Like, this is how all markets are. I mean, this is a little bit cleaner, I guess, but that's what I kind of miss, like the actual wet markets. And for people who've been to different parts of Asia, even places like Thailand, Vietnam, you would know what I mean. Like, you go to this market, it's messy, it's noisy, it's, you know, it's everything. But you get to buy the freshest things.
Exactly, because you know that it's come in that day, right? Somebody, even if it's the veg, right? You know it's been picked, and you can take it home. And quite often people will do that daily shop where whatever you find, you make.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas here, I'm like meal planning for the week because I'm putting in a food order.
Yeah, I think that's a different kind of almost wealth that I want to get to, you know, not so much just financial wealth, but to enjoy the luxury of going to a market in the morning to decide what you want to eat later. I think that would be amazing if we can achieve that.
But that's the thing here. I think that is less attainable because even if you had the time to do that, the markets to go and do it are so limited here.
Yeah.
Versus, and I think it has to be caveated by the fact that we live in very central London, so that plays its part. Whereas if we lived more rurally, it'd be a different situation.
You'd have more like local markets,
farm to table, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's interesting how we perceive that as wealth, right? Whereas across Asia, actually, it's just commonplace. And really, when you're at the market, correct me if I'm wrong, but you see all kinds of people there from all walks of life. It's not necessarily the preserve of the very, very wealthy.
I think supermarkets, I mean, this is my opinion, but you go to the supermarket to buy other groceries, right? Like kitchen paper or, you know, blue roll, things like that.
Not fresh produce.
No, and if you do buy meat, I mean, in most supermarkets in Hong Kong, actually, they do have a fresh seafood section where they have fish tanks and things are swimming when you buy them, because that's how much we value it, how much the market values fresh fish, right, or seafood. But when you go to buy things like, you know, mint or other kind of fresh meat, there's a huge difference between things that are labeled actually fresh and fresh frozen. Right? And we really value that, especially chicken. So a bit of a like detour, sidebar from this topic, but because of avian flu, there have been various points in time where you could not buy fresh chicken in Hong Kong because it's unhygienic, right? Like you're killing chickens in the market, and because of avian flu, that was not allowed, right? So because of these influences, to be able to buy an actually fresh chicken is so much more expensive than buying chickens that are, they go to this like central abattoir where everything is clean and sterilized. So that's grade 2, I would say. So grade 1 would be fresh, actual, alive chicken. Grade 2 would be this. And then you would have the imported like frozen chicken or pre-frozen chicken. So there's a hierarchy among chickens.
Interesting.
Is what I'm saying.
So I've known about that with fish. So people will sneer at this slightly, but of course the absolute freshest is, you know, your fishmonger, fresh fish that day, fish market, Billingsgate, that kind of thing. You know, it's come off the boat. But the fish that we can buy that is fresh, even at a supermarket on a counter, is quite often flash frozen at source.
Yeah.
And then defrosted again. Which is why there is a movement amongst, I know, there are companies that you and I have both used where the fish is frozen at source and it's kept frozen.
Yeah.
And it's delivered to you that way. And the idea being that actually that is at its freshest, that you are going to get it. If you don't live, and we don't unfortunately live somewhere that has a river running outside.
We do, but you wouldn't want to eat the fish in it.
Absolutely not. So I'm aware of it from a fish point of view, but I didn't realise it was the same with chicken. But yeah, it's interesting you said that.
Yeah, a hierarchy of chickens.
And on that note, we shall see you next week for another episode. Subscribe, rate and review on your favourite podcast platform and follow us on Instagram at Culturally Speaking Podcast. You can also check out our website culturallyspeaking.co.uk for a transcript of this episode. Share your stories or your show ideas with us by sending us an email at theculturallyspeaking@gmail.com.